Have you ever imagined spending years building something from absolutely nothing, sacrificing your time, your energy, your sleep, and sometimes even your relationships, only to be told one day that you no longer belong there? Imagine creating a company with your own hands, watching it grow from a small dream into a global success, and then finding yourself standing outside its doors while everyone else continues without you. Most people would never recover from something like that. Most people would walk away broken. But today's story is not about most people. It's about a man who lost everything he had worked for and somehow turned that loss into one of the greatest comebacks in history. This is the story of Steve Jobs, the visionary entrepreneur who helped build Apple, got fired from the very company he created, and later returned to save it from collapse. His journey is filled with ambition, disappointment, resilience, and lessons that continue to inspire millions of people around the world. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If you enjoy stories about technology, business, history, and extraordinary people who changed the world, you're in the right place. Now sit back, relax, and let's begin. Long before the world knew the name Steve Jobs, he was simply a curious young boy growing up in California. He wasn't born into a wealthy family, nor did he have a clear roadmap to success. What he did have was curiosity. He constantly asked questions, took things apart, and wanted to understand how the world worked. While other children played with toys, Steve was fascinated by electronics and machines. He loved discovering what was hidden beneath the surface. That curiosity would eventually become one of the most powerful forces in his life. As a teenager, Steve met another young man who shared his passion for technology. His name was Steve Wozniak. While Jobs was a dreamer with big ideas, Wozniak was an engineering genius who could build things that seemed almost magical. The two became close friends and quickly realized they worked well together. Jobs could imagine the future and Wozniak could build it. Together, they formed a partnership that would eventually change the world. In the mid-1970s, computers were nothing like they are today. They were large, expensive machines used mainly by governments, universities, and major corporations. The idea that ordinary people would someday own personal computers seemed unrealistic to many experts. Most people simply couldn't imagine a computer sitting on a desk inside a normal home. But Steve Jobs could. He believed technology should belong to everyone, not just specialists and scientists. He saw a future that few others could see. In 1976, Jobs and Wozniak decided to turn that vision into reality. Working from a small family garage, they founded Apple. It wasn't a glamorous beginning. There were no luxurious offices, no large teams of employees, and no guarantees of success. There were only two young men, a handful of resources, and an enormous dream. They worked tirelessly, assembling computers by hand and searching for customers willing to believe in their vision. At first, success came slowly. Every sale mattered. Every customer mattered. Every dollar mattered. There were moments when failure seemed much more likely than success. But Jobs refused to quit. He believed they were building something important, and that belief pushed him forward even when the future looked uncertain. Eventually, their efforts began to pay off. The Apple I attracted attention, and the Apple II became one of the most successful personal computers of its time. Suddenly, Apple was no longer a small startup operating out of a garage. The company was growing rapidly. Investors arrived. Employees were hired. Sales increased. What had started as a dream was becoming a business empire. Steve Jobs was still in his 20s, yet he was already becoming one of the most talked about figures in technology. Magazines featured his story. Journalists wanted interviews. Business leaders began paying attention. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect success story. A young entrepreneur had beaten the odds and achieved what many considered impossible. But behind the scenes, things were becoming more complicated. Success was creating new challenges. The company was growing larger, expectations were rising, and pressure was increasing. Steve Jobs demanded excellence from everyone around him. He pushed employees harder than they thought possible. Some admired him for his passion and vision. Others found him difficult to work with. Few people realized that the very qualities helping him build Apple would eventually contribute to one of the biggest crises of his life. And that crisis was closer than anyone imagined. The early success of Apple transformed Steve Jobs into a rising star. Everywhere he went, people wanted to hear his ideas. Investors admired his confidence, customers loved Apple's products, and the media portrayed him as a young genius who was helping shape the future. But while the public celebrated Apple's success, life inside the company was becoming increasingly complicated. Growth brought opportunities, but it also brought pressure, disagreements, and expectations that seemed to increase with every passing month. Steve Jobs was not interested in building ordinary products. He didn't want Apple to simply compete with other computer companies. He wanted Apple to create products that felt revolutionary, products that would make people stop and say, "I've never seen anything like this before." His standards were incredibly high. He expected perfection, and he expected everyone around him to pursue that same level of perfection. Employees often found themselves working long nights and weekends trying to meet his expectations. Some found the experience inspiring. Others found it exhausting. Yet even those who struggled to work with Jobs often admitted that he had a unique ability to push people beyond what they believed they were capable of achieving. As Apple continued to grow, competition in the technology industry intensified. New companies entered the market. Established companies began developing their own personal computers. The race to define the future of computing had officially begun. Steve Jobs understood that Apple needed another breakthrough if it wanted to stay ahead. He wanted a product that would once again change the way people interacted with technology. That vision eventually became the Macintosh. To Steve Jobs, the Macintosh wasn't just another computer. It was a statement. It represented everything he believed technology should be. Simple, elegant, powerful, accessible. He wanted ordinary people to feel comfortable using computers. He wanted technology to feel human rather than intimidating. While many computers at the time required complicated commands and technical knowledge, the Macintosh focused on making computing easier and more intuitive. Jobs became completely obsessed with the project. Every detail mattered to him. The shape of the machine mattered. The appearance of the packaging mattered. The way customers felt when they opened the box mattered. He believed great products were created by caring deeply about every small detail. This philosophy inspired many members of the Macintosh team, but it also created enormous pressure. Months turned into years as engineers worked tirelessly to bring the Macintosh to life. Deadlines became tighter. Expectations became higher. Tensions increased. Jobs constantly challenged his team to improve their work. Sometimes he praised them. Sometimes he criticized them harshly. Many employees described working on the Macintosh as one of the most difficult experiences of their careers. Yet many also described it as one of the most meaningful. Finally, after years of effort, the Macintosh was ready. When it launched, excitement spread throughout the technology world. The product attracted enormous attention. Customers were fascinated by its graphical interface and user-friendly design. The launch generated headlines and positioned Apple as one of the most innovative companies in the world. For a moment, it seemed like Steve Jobs had done it again. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the excitement and celebration, serious problems were beginning to emerge. The Macintosh generated attention, but sales did not grow as quickly as Apple had hoped. Some customers loved the product, but others found it expensive. Financial pressures increased. Executives became concerned. Investors began asking difficult questions. At the same time, Steve Jobs' leadership style was becoming a growing source of conflict within the company. His relentless pursuit of perfection often led to disagreements with other executives. Some believed he was pushing Apple toward greatness. Others believed he was creating instability. The larger Apple became, the harder it became to manage a company based entirely on one person's vision. Around this period, Apple hired an experienced executive named John Sculley. Jobs believed Sculley could help guide the company as it continued to expand. At first, the relationship appeared promising. The two men shared ambitious goals for Apple and worked closely together. But beneath the surface, tensions were slowly developing. Both men had strong opinions. Both believed they understood what was best for Apple. and both wanted influence over the company's future. As financial challenges increased, disagreements between Jobs and Scully became more frequent. Meetings grew tense. Important decisions became battlegrounds. Employees found themselves choosing sides. Some supported Jobs and his bold vision. Others supported Scully's M. As tensions inside Apple continued to grow, Steve Jobs found himself facing a challenge unlike anything he had experienced before. In the early days of Apple, problems had seemed simple. If a product needed improvement, they improved it. If money was tight, they worked harder. If people doubted them, they proved them wrong. But now the problem wasn't technology. It wasn't competition. It wasn't a lack of innovation. The problem was happening inside the company itself. The atmosphere at Apple had become increasingly divided. Meetings that once focused on building the future now felt like political battles. Conversations that should have been productive often ended in frustration. Executives disagreed about the company's direction. Managers worried about declining performance. Investors demanded results. And at the center of it all stood Steve Jobs. For years, Jobs had been Apple's driving force. His passion, creativity, and vision had helped transform a garage startup into one of the most recognizable technology companies in the world. But many people inside Apple were beginning to question whether his leadership style was still what the company needed. They admired his ability to dream big, but they worried about the instability that often followed him. Some believed his relentless pursuit of perfection was hurting the company's ability to operate efficiently. Others felt his intense personality created unnecessary conflict. Steve Jobs saw things very differently. He believed Apple was losing sight of its purpose. He believed the company was becoming too cautious, too focused on short-term concerns, and too willing to compromise on innovation. In his mind, Apple existed to create products that changed the world, not simply products that generated predictable profits. He worried that the company was drifting away from the vision that had made it successful in the first place. As disagreements intensified, the relationship between Steve Jobs and John Scully deteriorated further. What had once appeared to be a strong partnership was now becoming a serious rivalry. Both men wanted influence over Apple's future. Both believed they were acting in the company's best interests. But their visions for Apple were becoming increasingly incompatible. The conflict eventually reached the board of directors. The board faced a difficult decision. On one side was Steve Jobs, the charismatic co-founder whose vision had built Apple. On the other side was John Scully, the experienced executive many believed could provide stability and structure. The outcome of this decision would shape the future of the company. For Steve Jobs, the situation felt almost impossible to comprehend. Apple wasn't just a business. It was a part of his identity. He had devoted years of his life to building it. He had sacrificed countless hours, endured enormous stress, and poured his energy into turning a dream into reality. The idea that he could lose influence within Apple seemed unimaginable. Yet that possibility was becoming increasingly real. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a series of critical meetings, the power struggle finally reached its breaking point. The board chose to support Scully. Jobs found himself stripped of authority. Key responsibilities were taken away. Decisions that had once belonged to him were now controlled by others. At only 30 years old, Steve Jobs was effectively removed from the leadership of the company he had created. Imagine the shock. Imagine walking through the halls of a company you built from nothing and realizing you no longer have control over its future. Imagine looking around at products, employees, and offices that exist because of your vision, while knowing that your voice no longer carries the weight it once did. For Steve Jobs, the experience was devastating. The public saw headlines and corporate announcements. But what they couldn't see was the emotional impact behind the scenes. Years of effort seemed to collapse all at once. The dream that had defined much of his adult life suddenly felt out of reach. Friends worried about him. Colleagues wondered what he would do next. Critics predicted that his career was over. Some people even suggested that Apple would be better off without him. For the first time in years, Steve Jobs found himself without a clear direction. He later described this period as one of the darkest moments of his life. The confidence that had carried him through countless challenges was shaken. The future felt uncertain. The path forward was unclear. Many people in similar circumstances would have walked away permanently. Many would have accepted defeat and spent the rest of their lives talking about what might have been. But Steve Jobs was different. Even in the middle of disappointment, a small part of him remained curious about what might come next. He didn't know it yet, but losing Apple was about to force him into a journey that would make him stronger, wiser, and ultimately more successful than ever before. At the time, however, none of that was visible. All he could see was loss. All he could feel was failure. And as he left the company he loved, he faced a question that would determine the rest of his life. What do you do when the dream you've spent years building suddenly disappears? For Steve Jobs, the answer would change history. Walking away from Apple was one of the hardest experiences Steve Jobs had ever faced. For years, his life had revolved around the company. Every major decision, every goal, every dream had been connected to Apple in some way. Suddenly, all of that was gone. The routines that had once filled his days disappeared. The meetings stopped. The responsibilities vanished. And for the first time in a very long time, Steve Jobs found himself standing still. The silence was difficult. When people experience a major failure, the outside world often assumes they immediately move on. But real life rarely works that way. Failure has a way of following people. It lingers in quiet moments. It appears in unexpected thoughts. It raises uncomfortable questions. Was it worth it? Could things have been different? What if I had made another choice? Steve Jobs wrestled with those questions. He had achieved extraordinary success, yet he felt defeated. He had built one of the most admired technology companies in the world, yet he found himself without a place in it. For a period of time, he genuinely considered stepping away from the technology industry altogether. The disappointment cut deeper than most people realized. But something inside him refused to stay defeated. As the months passed, Steve slowly began rediscovering the passion that had driven him from the beginning. Long before Apple became famous, before magazine covers and interviews and boardroom battles, he had simply loved creating things. He loved imagining possibilities. He loved turning ideas into reality. And that passion was still alive. One day, Steve came to an important realization. Apple had taken away his position, but it had not taken away his creativity. The company could remove him from a building, but it could not remove the imagination that helped build the company in the first place. That realization changed everything. Instead of focusing on what he had lost, Steve began focusing on what he could build next. In 1985, he founded a new company called Next. To many observers, the decision seemed risky. Starting another company after such a public setback looked almost reckless. Critics questioned whether anyone would trust him again. Some investors remained skeptical. Others believed his best years were already behind him. Steve ignored the noise. He approached Next with the same intensity that had fueled Apple's early days. Once again, he surrounded himself with talented engineers. Once again, he challenged people to think differently. Once again, he became obsessed with creating products that pushed technology forward. The goal was ambitious. Next would build powerful computers designed for education, research, and advanced professional work. Steve wanted the machines to be beautiful, innovative, and unlike anything else on the market. As always, he focused intensely on details. The design mattered. The experience mattered. The quality mattered. Nothing was allowed to be ordinary. Yet despite all the effort and innovation, Next faced serious challenges. The computers were impressive, but they were also expensive. Many organizations admired the technology but struggled to justify the cost. Sales remained limited. The company earned respect within the industry but failed to achieve the widespread commercial success that Apple had enjoyed. To outsiders, Next appeared disappointing. Some journalists labeled it a failure. Some business analysts questioned Steve's judgment. Others wondered if his ability to build successful companies had disappeared. But history often hides its biggest surprises beneath apparent setbacks. Although Next never became a household name, its technology was incredibly advanced. The software developed at Next would later become one of the most important foundations of modern computing. At the time, however, very few people understood how valuable that work would eventually become. While Steve was busy building Next, another unexpected opportunity entered his life. It came in the form of a small graphics division that had been struggling to find its place in the world. Most people saw a risky investment. Steve Jobs saw potential. He purchased the company and became its major supporter. That company was called Pixar. Today, the name Pixar is recognized around the globe. Millions of people associate it with beloved animated films and unforgettable characters. But during those early years, success was far from guaranteed. The company struggled financially. Projects took longer than expected. Profits were difficult to find. Many investors would have walked away. Many business leaders would have cut their losses. Steve stayed. He believed in the talent of the people working there. He believed they were capable of creating something extraordinary. Years passed. The challenges continued. Yet Pixar kept improving. Its artists refined their skills. Its technology advanced. Its ambitions grew. And then, after years of uncertainty, everything changed. A groundbreaking animated film entered production. A film unlike anything audiences had ever seen before. A film that would eventually transform the animation industry forever. Its name was Toy Story. At that moment, Steve Jobs had no way of knowing that the movie would become a massive success. He didn't know it would generate worldwide attention. He didn't know it would help establish Pixar as one of the most influential entertainment companies in history. What he did know was this: for the first time since leaving Apple, hope was returning. The failures no longer seemed permanent. The setbacks no longer seemed final. And although Steve Jobs couldn't see the future, events were already moving in a direction nobody expected. Back at Apple, the company that had pushed him out was beginning to face problems of its own. Serious problems. Problems that would eventually force Apple to make a decision few people could have imagined. A decision that would bring Steve Jobs back to the place where this story began.